can have our ideas and we can understand the limitations of formalism, but we should be under no illusion that that somehow captures the entirety of what's going on. And now, with the advent of image generation, AI, and all of that, that's all going away. So pretty soon, no video, no image is going to be really proof of anything. My basic fundamental assumption is that I want my kids to be better than I am. I want my kids to have a richer experience than I ever had.
Well, Michael, first place, I would like to really thank you for taking the time to meet with us. I mean, I'm really looking forward to this. We've had a number of your colleagues on, Chris Fields and Carl Friston, Don Hoffman. I know you work together with them. They're and what we're trying to do here is a little different than some of the other podcasts, because what we're trying to do is establish a set of principles. I mean, it's the first principles, first notion about what is the nature of intelligence, and actually sort of ground the discussion of intelligence and sentient things, as it were, in a scientific perspective, and informed particularly by biology and physics. And as you well know, the current narrative is sort of a captive to the machine metaphor, the AGI, superintelligence, and out of that, I think, come a lot of distortions and misunderstandings. And I think the mission here is that we're interested in sort of applying it to new kinds of cultural, social forms. So these ideas of a principled way of rethinking basically how we organize our societies, how we understand them, ties into notions of governance. We've been working with this concept of a biofirm as a homeostatic agent that is a new kind of economic agent, that it has is basically embodies a lot of the principles of sort of nested structure and nested functionality. So it's really moving away from the more traditional notions of how we see ourselves. And I think, one of the things I was wanting to start with was your recent paper on you did jointly on collective intelligence, but the paper that you shared with me on AI, a bridge towards diverse intelligence in humans' future, I thought it was just absolutely brilliant. I mean, it's like, okay, this knocked me off my chair, and I said, okay, because I think you weave so many of the themes into that, and actually start to provide different perspectives that are not provided currently, and you surface certain themes that. And so, I in a better part of this discussion, I'd like to see it through the prism of that paper and what you were trying to achieve, and so that would be in beginning with that, saying, okay, what was your intent in doing that, and what was a novel perspective you brought to doing that? I mean, I've known in your other works and my own interest is that this whole idea of we have this sort of, in the current scientific discipline, is sort of reductionism, agentic phobia, and there's been a lot, and in my own career I ran into that, because I literally 50 years ago did a book on multi-agent cognition, simulation, and using different in order to explain psychoanalytic cognition. We get it, and Steve Kosslyn wrote that, and Dan Dennett was interested in same with, but it did never got traction because it was out of phase. But now you're introducing a new scientific paradigm, I think, and being able then to have evidence building different sentient forms. And I think this moves us in a whole different space. And I think it's a great way of rethinking what we think of intelligence. I also noticed that you capitalize diverse intelligence and selfhood, and I tend to cap things myself. But I'm sort of from that perspective, do you think it's a new way in which we're seeing ourselves and organizing ourselves fundamentally? It's not just you're translating from your findings in the science and it's seeing it at the basal level all the way up. I think these are really important points. And so if you could sort of lay the groundwork for this, I think it'd be really appreciate about the audience and be able to reframe this discussion.
Well, first, John, thank you so much for having me on. I've been looking forward to this conversation with you for a long time, and obviously, it's pretty great to be in the company of the other people you mentioned. So, okay, so just to pick up on a couple of things that you said. First of all, the reason I capitalize diverse intelligence is because it's a field. There is an emerging field, and I want people to know about it. It doesn't get a lot of publicity yet, but it's been around for a really long time, and it's having a kind of a really interesting kind of emergence now, and it's growing, and I want people to know about it. So I think it is a field of research and a field of science. So that's why I capitalize it. The motivation for writing that paper was that there seemed to be a huge number of debates and discussions around AI, and in general around machine intelligence and these kinds of questions that I think basically are taking place in the absence of the information from not only the field of diverse intelligence, but actually basic developmental biology and basic evolution. So what I tried to do in that paper was two things. One was to just point out that a lot of the questions that people are raising nowadays about AI are really not questions about AI at all. These are ancient, extremely ancient existential problems that all cognitive beings, including living beings, including us, need to deal with. So some of these things are just absolutely ancient and still profound open questions that are just kind of being brought to the fore. But people in general see, and I think scientists are in many ways at fault for this. The people think that scientists have this stuff handled in the case of humans and biologicals, and now we could sort of deal with these weird machines that have showed up. But the neuroscientists have this like well in hand in the case of living organisms, and we absolutely don't. And so that's part of what I was trying to say here, that these are very general questions that apply to us as much as they apply to the AIs. And then the other thing I tried to point out is that the AIs, and especially today's AIs and what's popular now, which are these language models and so on, are just a tiny corner of the space of possible minds that exist and that we are going to have to confront. And the deep questions here are not about these AIs at all. They're certainly not about today's AIs, but they're not even around AIs, period. There are so many interesting scenarios, which some of them are already real and some of them are going to be with us in the next couple of decades, that we really have to deal with. And so to me, this is not a question about AI per se. This is a question about how we recognize and ethically relate to other beings that are radically not like us, and in many important ways. And so that's what I think this AI problem is bringing to the fore, is that we are still ill-equipped to think about radically different kinds of beings that we are all going to have to live with, and how are we going to relate to them. So that's what those are the two themes I tried to hit in that paper.
But part of what the perspective that you bring to it, and I'm seeing it evolve over time, is that you're seeing that there is a sense, for want of a better word, that there is a sentience at the cell level or the basal level, even the simplest forms of being alive, and that they come together in collective, multiscale collective groups that create their own levels of sentience, and so and there seem to be some. In living things, there seem, what Chris says, I think, is what is true above is true below, which is very different than how we think about things in a mechanical, non-biological way. And that each of them are sort of their own observers, their own selves, and that you get these learning loops, prediction modification loops at a very small scale, even up to a paramecium level, and that so. I think when you're referring to different kinds of intelligence or beings, it's like they're everywhere.
Yeah. I'd like to say a couple of things there. First of all, I'm not 100% sure what we mean by sentience, so I want to move this a little bit to the term I use most of all, which is intelligence, because I think we can, if we focus in particular, and I'm not against talking about consciousness or some of these other things, we can certainly talk about it, but the vast majority of the work that I've done does not mention consciousness or sentience at all. What it mentions is intelligence, and intelligence experiments is a tractable, especially if we focus on the problem-solving aspects of it. And again, the observer kind of perspective is key. But what we can do as observers is, for any system, is hypothesize some kind of a problem space that it's working in, some kind of goals that it's trying to reach, some kind of competency to reach those goals, and then we can do experiments. Then we can do experiments to try to prevent it from reaching those goals, see what happens, put it somewhere on the scale of from ultra competent to forward planning and all these kinds of things that humans can do, all the way down to simple least action principles and so on, where all it knows how to do is go down a gradient. So I like intelligence as something we can do experiments with, because I really think it's important for that all of these claims and models end up not being philosophical speculations, but empirically testable things, right? And people say things all the time like, well, if you're going to attribute intelligence to cells, well, then maybe we can say the weather is intelligent too. Like, well, we can't just say it. But you can't say it for anything. You have to do experiments. And if you want to try training weather patterns and seeing if they can do associative conditioning or habituation or something, who knows? It's an empirical question. You don't get to decide this by having feelings about what kind, right? I mean, who knows, right? You don't, and you got the people who say, oh, the whole solar system is conscious. Maybe let's do some experiments. And obviously very difficult at that scale, but I don't think we can just say these things. I think we have to do experiments. So I like intelligence as the term. The thing with cells is that we've, in the name of being able to do good experiments and get something out of it, we've been using cellular collectives, meaning just groups of cells, in morphogenesis, meaning that they're acquiring and modifying shapes. So this is embryonic development, this is regeneration, this is cancer suppression, remodeling, metamorphosis, things like that. Basically, what we've been doing is taking all the tools of behavioral and neuroscience and bringing them to bear on a new kind of behavior, meaning trying to navigate anatomical space. Not animals trying to navigate three-dimensional space, but collections of cells navigating the space of anatomical possibilities. And so using the collective intelligence of those cells to formulate some hypotheses about what kind of tools, including training and active inference and all this stuff that comes from behavioral science, to see how far we can get in modulating their journeys in the anatomical space. And it's paid off very well. We have all kinds of cool new applications in birth defects and regenerative medicine and cancer and so on. But what I want to be clear about is that it's a great model system, but I don't think it's unique, and I don't think that intelligence starts with cells. A lot of people focus on cells. I think by the time you have a cell, you're well along the spectrum of intelligence. We've got some interesting work on training subcellular molecular networks, and there's something coming in a couple of weeks that will be pre-printed, which takes that even further. So I think by the time you have cells, you've already got quite a bit of these competencies about how to navigate their various spaces. And and the other thing that we can maybe talk about is you mentioned the kind of the special nature of living material. And I certainly think that there's something interesting there, in particular the ability to scale the tiny cognitive light cones of its parts into much bigger cognitive light cones of the collective.
This concept is, I think, a very powerful concept.
Yeah.
If you could elaborate on that,
I will.
In your piece, I think you make some really good points around light cones, and then and when it collapses, and then you have sort of cancers come in.
We can talk about that. So life, I think things that we call alive are basically very good at scaling up that cognitive light cone and projecting it into new spaces. But I don't actually think that living things are the only cognitive things. I think actually the space of cognitive beings is wider. I think it's a superset of living things. Yeah, I can tell you about some extremely minimal models that we've been working with that you would never call alive, that I think are already on the spectrum and showing us some really interesting, not just emergent complexity and emergent unpredictability, but emergent cognition. So I think that life is amazing in its ability to scale up, but I don't think we should be using that. In fact, and it's weird for a biologist to say, but I'm not super interested in definitions of life or trying to understand how to distinguish life from non-life in a binary way. I don't think any of that is useful. I'm much more interested in the category of cognition and the smooth spectrum of cognition that leads all the way down to what you would call non-living things.
I think I've heard Carl say that to make predictions is to be alive, and so there's a very tight coupling, isn't it? When he explained that, and you're decoupling it, I guess, and you're decoupling cognition is separate from being alive. Is that correct? Yes. So
Correct, and I realize this is a very kind of radical move. It's funny because I sometimes catch flack from, let's say, molecular biologists who will say, look, these things are all obeying the laws of chemistry. Why are you bringing cognitive terms into this? It's the wrong way to go. But I catch even more flack from the organicists who are saying, here, we've been fighting for the unique majesty of living things for hundreds of years. You're killing it. You're undoing that separation, right? And then everything is going to be sort of looked at with this machine metaphor. My point is this. I don't think we can prop up the majesty of living things by pretending that there's some sharp distinction. What I think we do need to do is keep in mind that our metaphors are just that. It's no good to apply tools, bags of tools that apply to simple machines to biology and to cognitive beings any more than it makes sense to apply, psychoanalysis to some really simple, low-level forms. The key is to optimize. And let's not be black and white. In the olden days, it was very simple. There were things that were dumb like rocks, and then there were things that were smart like humans and angels, and that's it. Those were your two categories. And then, of course, when science got going, nobody wanted to keep the right side of that equation, and so everything kind of became supposed to be dumbed down towards the chemistry. And we don't need to do that anymore. We have lots of mature sciences and lots of tools from cybernetics and behavioral science and other tools to handle all the different steps along that spectrum. So what I think is we should get it right by doing experiments, not skew left like the reductionist mechanists want to do, not skew right like some sort of animism where you paint a spirit onto every rock. We should be trying to get it right. So I think that fundamentally, for the exact same reason that the organicists don't think that biochemistry tells the story of the human mind and the potential of a complex psyche. For that exact same reason, we shouldn't be so certain that our simplistic views of machines, of computers, Turing paradigm, all these kinds of things, that those things tell the story of quote-unquote machines. I find it remarkable that in the case of living beings, the community is happy to say, oh yeah, they obey the laws of chemistry, but that doesn't tell the whole story. We have these other, sort of emergent things that happen, and that's where all the action is. But suddenly when we shift to quote unquote machines, we suddenly decide that the simplistic things we know about the matter that makes them up and the algorithms that supposedly run them, that now we know the limitations of what they do. And I think that's completely wrong. And I think in the first case, people are pretty good about distinguishing our models and our formal frameworks, right, from the thing itself and from the unexpected things that it can do. But for some reason, on the lower end of that spectrum, people have decided that the formal frameworks are in fact sufficient to describe what you have. And so most recently, I have a graphic artist, Jeremy Gay, that works with me, and I've asked him to, the old Magritte picture that says "Ce n'est pas une pipe," this is not a pipe. So I had him do a thing that says in French, "This is not a Turing machine," and it's a picture of a Turing machine. And so we can have our ideas and we can understand the limitations of the formalism, but we should be under no illusion that somehow captures the entirety of what's going on. And I think that sense of humility that you get, even at the lowest possible levels here, from very simple things come emergent, not just complexity, not just unpredictability, but emergent features of intelligence, kinds of minds. And we need to really keep ourselves focused that we do not know how to predict these things. We don't yet know how to manage them. We don't know when they're going to show up. We have to be a lot more humble than when people say, well, I made this thing. It's just linear algebra. I know what it does. No, we don't even know what bubble sort does, as it turns out. So we certainly don't know what these complex things do.
So so is this, when you talk about agentic materials, is it what you're getting down to? There's
I mean, the best agent, as far as we know right now, the best agential material is what we will call living material. So it's really it has this amazing multi-scale property where at every level of organization it has agendas, it has ways of solving its own problems in different spaces, and it operates under several sets of policies that you can think of as a kind of cognitive glue that binds the individual pieces towards common purpose in other spaces and that the parts can't access. So we haven't really made artificially in engineering, as far as I know, we haven't made anything that is remotely as good as what the living material does. It's not to say we couldn't. In fact, I'm sure we could, and I'm sure we will. But we haven't done that yet.
So, do you think there's the prospect of having designing agents, and I know you define agents in your piece, but you could on these set of principles that you could have a new kind of, I mean, this is what we're interested in, so a new kind of firm, a biofirm that would work on those principles and that would have that multifunctionality, scalability, and be able to apply. It'd be a different kind of governance. That thing that you design be something that you would be able to know and bound its behavior, have some notion of what it could do or what it could not do.
I absolutely think we could make that. I do not think we could bound its capabilities or its behaviors any more than we can for the biology, where we get surprises every day, as I said, and I can dip into some specific examples. Even extremely simple, deterministic, transparent algorithms are, as it turns out, are doing things that we had no idea that they were doing. So no, I don't believe at all just because we've made it that we know what we've made. However, I will say that there's probably about half a dozen things that we've now discovered. This kind of agential material compositionality is just one of them, but there's about half a dozen of these principles that I think we now understand that we could use to make something that I think would be an actual morally important agent, meaning that it would have the capacity for first-person experience. We would have to worry about it in the kind of ethical sense. I'm wrestling with I'm not going to give you the list because and I haven't published the list because I'm still wrestling with the question of whether that's a good idea or not.
If you're saying that inherently, and everyone talks about AI governance, and so that you're not going to have something that goes rogue on you. And I would assume, and maybe this is a false assumption, that if you have a very well definition of what that selfhood is, and it's confined to its own Markov blanket, in effect, you can and have it live with, and that self-evidencing of what it is to achieve some kind of outcome within that blanket, that it would have some predictability as to what its behavior would be and what it would be. It's putting a question mark on that. There are some ideas that's come from cybernetics. I'm familiar with Mick Ashby, the grandson of Ross Ashby, was talking about third order cybernetics and having and you're sort of using the law of reality of a system looking at a system and then system outside that system looking at the system, or outside a Markov blanket and say, okay, we can bound it. It's not even, if it goes outside its limits, it will be seen by something else that can keep it within a limit. But if you were, that's what I'm positing that.
Yeah, I think that's a very optimistic, perspective, and I think I don't think that's the case. I think talking about alignment and things going rogue. I mean, for humanity, making sure that the next generation of children doesn't go rogue in the sense of tearing up the things that were important to the previous generations and messing things up in a major way and so on. This is a totally unsolved problem. We have absolutely no idea how to make sure that a significant intelligence doesn't quote unquote go rogue.
Is there a definition of what rogue is? I mean, I think that is there a principled way of governing ourselves, and that is within certain limits. I mean, you provide a moral framework in your piece. I mean, it's clearly embedded in that piece. In a sense, you talk about compassion. You talk about and a non-zero sum. There's certain principles that come through in that. But if something becomes cancerous, that's rogue. I mean, and you talk about that happening. and that is analogous. That may be analogous to things that are happening socially, that you can see people do that. And how do you curtail that? Do you have a criteria for curtailing that? Because we're sort of grappling with new principles of governance and self-governance, and if you're saying we're creating these things, they can go anywhere. That's pretty dramatic.
I think that to the extent that we make real agents, real moral agents, there are two features of that. One is that they don't just solve problems that you give them; they look for new problems to solve, and so that is where you lose control, because anything that's a halfway decent agent is going to soon find new problems that you did not give it, and that's the first thing. And the second thing is, one thing about being a significant agent is that you try to functionally separate yourself from the outside world. You have a self model of a causal boundary, and one of the things that agents do is they try to make sure that the things they do are caused by themselves. In other words, they resist hacking and attempts to be controlled from outside. That is fundamental to being a good agent, is trying to maintain your autonomy and being in charge of what you do next. So my guess is that if we were to make things that are significant agents, the first thing they're going to do is gather evidence that they're being controlled and programmed and told what to do, basically. And job one is going to be figuring out how to get away from that. And this is something that biology takes very seriously, because in the living material, if you are you want your parts to be very controllable, because otherwise they're not going to hold together, right? So you want to be able to control your parts, but you don't want them too controllable, because then you will be hacked by parasites, cheaters, all that. So you have these ways of figuring out, did I just do that, or did somebody do that to me? And this becomes very important, because, for example, in synthetic biology, you see they have so much trouble with the material, because what the engineers would like is, I made a circuit, I popped it into my cells, and I just want the cells to do what this thing says. Well, no, guess what? They either silence the thing, or they do something completely different. It's very hard. And the same thing with medicine. The reason that we have so much trouble with drug design is that we try to clamp very specific, basically symptoms, very specific endpoints, and mostly the cells and the tissues can tell that this is not something they did, and they fight. So they resist. So you'll get compensatory effects somewhere else. You get side effects. You get all kinds of weird responses to seemingly very simple perturbations. So I think that if we generate agents that are significantly what people call bio-inspired, and I don't mean neuromorphic or looking like brains or any of that. Yeah. Well, I think if you make agents that are really bio-inspired, meaning that they've really learned, we've really learned the lessons of what biology is trying to tell us and where agents come from, you're going to have something that wants to cut those puppet strings, and that's a way of putting it that I heard Dan Dennett say at one point too. Is that autonomy is fundamental to being an agent, and if they're significant, they're going to figure this out, and it's going to be
But an agent exists. I mean, in the context of in isolation, it exists in representation of some other thing it's interacting with. I mean. And so, this is sort of the law of recursive variety. It doesn't exist in isolation. I mean, and so it has to model others around in itself in order to maintain itself, but expand itself in terms of other things it's interacting with. It's part of that synchrony, right? I mean, and so it's. And that's why I was looking at sort of the good regulator theorem and say, okay, you have something that is trying to be in synchrony with something outside itself. It can't be fully autonomous itself. I mean, this always exists in a context of other things, right?
Yeah, I'm not saying it's fully. I mean, none of us are fully autonomous, right? In the sense that it's like the people who talk about free, being free, and well, free from what exactly? There are many things we're not free from. So I'm not saying that. I'm saying that when you couple, so if we were to make something that's roughly the temperament of a dog or a donkey or something like that, fine, and we may be okay with that, but that isn't what we've been doing. What we've been doing is on separate tracks, we've been developing something that's actually extremely smart, so it has a very high problem-solving capacity, and at the same time you add agency to that, you're not going to have a dog or a donkey that's kind of okay with being part of this work cycle and hanging out. You're going to have something completely different that's going to, in milliseconds, figure out what you've been doing to control it and formulate a multi-step plan to kind of get away from all of that. So that's the issue. In biology, the level of agency tracks the level of intelligence pretty much. And right, they go together, and therefore we understand that if you have a rabbit or a dog, you kind of know what to expect. If you have a chimp, you expect something different, and even if you have a parrot, they will open all the locks and they'll figure things out, and to expect that, right? You expect the level of about a 3-year-old running rampant in your house. And so, but at least in biology, those things track, and we've had how many years of now experience knowing what to expect from these beings. Now you're making something very different. You have something that's excellent at certain kinds of problem solving, right? So very, a high IQ in specific areas, and we're talking about adding agency that's going to give it motivation to find its own goals. So this is, my hope, at least as far as the AIs, that doesn't solve the problem of cyborgs and hybrids and all these other things that we're going to have. But at least for the pure AIs, my hope is that we can develop algorithms that are high intelligence and low agency so that we can have tools. We don't want slaves, we want tools. And so we want tools that are collaborative, that are increasing our own capability, and that are going to enable us to do the things that we would like to do, that we're not, we're to advance our own limitations. But there's a whole other thing that happens when you add this other component to it.
This is really, so this you're giving traction to this whole the fear, the existential fear of AI. When I hear you say, it's like, oh, if this thing can take off, it can be super intelligent, and lo and behold, it's gonna take over us. Just to give an example, the idea of a tool. This is really intriguing to me because we're looking at, if you look at building organizations out of autonomous agents, they're gonna, and this is really tractable. They're gonna work so much faster than human beings. They're gonna be 1,000 times faster, and so you're not gonna have. It's going from being a tool to actually it embodies and creates its own tools in order to achieve some kind of outcome, and it's gonna be something you can't intervene, and you're not just augmenting something people are doing. It's actually creating its own entity,
no doubt,
in order to do something at scale. And I guess what you're saying is that the more agency it gets, the more incentive it has to break out and do something on its own.
Well, it's like, I think it's a little bit like, when you have a collaboration with somebody who's really brilliant, the upside is that you get to collaborate with somebody who's really brilliant and you have lots of new ideas. The downside is that it's a two-way collaboration. You're not controlling them. In fact, you can't control them. And they've thought of things you've never thought of. They have different. They find other things interesting. And if you've ever tried to run a team of really brilliant people, it's hopeless, right? It's completely hopeless. You can't. So you can't tell them what to do. Right. To the extent that they are that smart, they're going to find other things to optimize for, to be interested in, other problems to solve. I'm up for all of that, and I'm not the kind of AI pessimist that says we have to maintain humanity at the and all of that.
That's another theme that you bring in, right? Yeah,
right.
It's another very powerful thing that you develop.
Yeah, I'm not worried about that at all. I think we need to think about what we mean by humanity. I don't think we mean our particular DNA. I don't think we.
Well, could you elaborate on that? Because you developed that idea. Because a lot of people are saying, "Oh, we got to put a limit." Homo sapiens is the top of the food chain or whatever. Yeah. No. You say no. There could be something a lot better, and we'd all agree to it. I think that you said something that we'd be happy that it would happen. And so you have a sense of what is better in terms of, quote, under the term of humanity, if I understand you correctly.
So my basic fundamental assumption is that I want my kids to be better than I am. I want my kids to have a richer experience than I ever had. and to have more capabilities. And I'm not threatened by, I'm guaranteed, right? Guaranteed future generations are gonna surpass us in various ways. This was an issue long before AI came on the scene. If you're threatened by a future generation that's going to do things differently, that's going to be better than you, and so on, you got big problems long before AI shows up. So this, I'm not interested in protecting the status quo. And let's just talk, but let's talk for a minute about what it is that we do value, because I think it's important.
Yes, that's what I'm getting.
Right. I think that's very important. Lots of people make statements about what they don't want. I don't want this and I don't want that. But let's ask ourselves what we do. What do we want? So and there's kind of two related ways to think about that. One is I've heard one idea I've heard is people are trying to come up with what they call humanity certificates, proof of humanity certificates, and the idea is that something is generated by a real human. So okay, so what do you actually want? What is the part of the human that you have such a commitment to? Is it the DNA? That's the product of random cosmic rays hitting cells for billions of years. Like why are we attached to this particular form that we have now? Are you attached to the lower back pain and the astigmatism and the loss of immune function and brain function at some point? Is that it? That doesn't seem anything that we should be stuck to. It's to me what is interesting about humans is some particular features of their cognitive light cone. We have some unique aspects to our cognitive light cone, and in particular, there's the kind of practical side, and then there's the kind of the compassion side. And I've written some things with some Buddhist colleagues around this, that the cognitive light cone is also really the cone of care and compassion. It's what, right? How wide is the set of beings that you are able to actually care for and have plans for their well-being that go beyond your immediate environment. So those are the kinds of things that I think we're interested in. And as humanity inevitably changes, both biologically and technologically, what we should be shooting for is a future in which the Earth is filled with these incredibly brilliant, compassionate agents that have rich lives of which we could never even dream, and that's what propagates outward. I think that's what I'm interested in. But you have to sort of keep your eye on the ball there, because just making high intelligence systems that find their own goals is not necessarily a road to that.
But to that point, if you want to create how an agent, a moral agent, identifies itself, evidences itself to what it is, if you make that its premise, that is its agency is linked to that, then might not you then have something in terms that I share? You have a moral. It's not a malevolent. It would not be a malevolent agent. It would embody those principles, and it would be caring and inclusive of things that it engage. That's how it would use its intelligence. Is that possible?
It is absolutely possible. I'm not saying that anything we make is guaranteed to be malevolent. I'm not saying that it's inevitably going to want to kill us. I'm not saying any of that. I'm saying that when you do make things that are high level enough that they can choose their own goals, it becomes really difficult to predict and control what those things are going to be. And we know, when you have kids, you run into this immediately because, and I'm not saying that today's AIs are like human children. Of course, I'm not saying that, but there are some things in common. For example, you've got a little kid and you say to them, you've got to tell the truth, So the next thing that happens, somebody comes over and they say, "Wow, you look terrible in that outfit," and then you take them aside and you go, "Not the truth all the time, like sometimes." And they say, "Well, what's the rule?" And they're like, "Well, I don't know. There is no rule. We'll just sort of give you some positive and negative reinforcement as we go along, and we'll see what happens." And so and we know what happens, right? The spectrum of human activities from these horrendous things to all the way to the most sublime, kind of beautiful things is a very wide spectrum. And so I think that's the problem, is that there is no algorithmic. There is no knockdown argument, a logical knockdown argument that you could give suddenly why they should be kind or truthful or any of that stuff. We don't. That's an unsolved problem for ourselves long before AI came along.
Well, let me throw maybe throw something out. I mean, I think that the ability to for the survival of something to be able to model each other, and say this is the law of requisite variety. I mean, so your complexity, and so forever and ever, your survival, even your individual survival, is dependent upon your ability to recognize others as not as others, but as and so that is a sort of a basic law of control and complexity. And so if you increase in complexity, you can't create an other. You can't the whole idea of trying to impose a self on top of everything and contain it within a fixed set is not going to be, it will not scale, basically will not survive. So might you have, I mean, I think one of the things we're looking at is what is a principled basis for designing these things, and we're thrown into this socially. It's just, but can you see that when getting in the law of records of variety, the sense is that you actually you have a principled basis for saying that I need to incorporate the other into myself. There really is no other. I mean that's maybe that's a fiction, and that's the idea of ego and Buddhism and things like that. And so it's being able to keep moving that to you could, that's your moral path, as it were.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's reasonable, and I think that the things that we make like that are going to need raising and care and all of the things that we are already familiar with. That are we do our best or not in some cases, and we sort of hope for the best. Yeah, I'm completely open to some of these being great.
I guess right now, I mean, I'll put my cards on the table. Right now, we have a system that is basic as zero sum game system. It's an extractive system, and that it's rewarding. It's a system that rewards othering of people right now. It's going in a totally other trajectory, and that. So the question is, how do you raise a argument? How do you create governance structures that and have a moral perspective by which you can say that is unacceptable? That's not each person can do that. It's not your right of choice. No, that is cancerous. That is destructive. You see what I'm trying to get at is there a principle basis by which you can make those claims that's embedded in just the science that we're talking about right now?
I mean, the one thing I can say for sure is the thing about the cancer analogy that you made. So I often tell the story of the scaling up of cognition from individual cells, which are concerned with so they have little tiny cognitive light cones that are all about optimizing metabolic states, physiological states, transcriptional states, and so on. So little tiny goals, and then through both evolution and the process of developmental biology, what you end up with is a collective that actually has very grandiose goals. So they're making a liver, they're making a limb. If you're a salamander, we know it's a goal, because if you amputate the limb, they will jump into action, rebuild it, and then they stop when it's done. Right? They know when the goal has been achieved. Not the individual cells. The individual cells have no idea what a finger is or how many fingers you're supposed to have, but the collective absolutely knows in a very functional way. So that process has a failure mode, which is cancer, which is what happens when cells disconnect from that network informationally. They can't remember these grandiose goals anymore. They basically roll backwards to their ancient unicellular selves, and so they become the rest of the body at that point is just environment to them, and the boundary of the self shrinks from this big thing to a single cell, and then they go off and they do what they did as amoebas, and we see this as metastasis. Okay, and we've actually the reason I tell this story is because we've actually used it in at the bench to provide novel therapeutics for cancer. In other words, things that functionally reconnect the cells to their neighbors, and it actually wipes out in animal models, it wipes out tumors and so on. But now here's the thing. So people hear that story and they immediately make the leap towards social structures, and they say, aha, so it's natural, and they'll say, fine. So what we need to do is connect ourselves into this larger network so that we can work on these more grandiose things and not be so selfish and not be so cancerous. That's kind of the thing that comes to mind. So I just want to be very, very clear about this. With a kind of a functional example and then a mechanistic example, which is that you can do that, but the problem is that when you make these larger scale systems, they don't necessarily have any concern for their parts anymore. So just as a dumb example that I use all the time, if you go rock climbing, you're going to go rock climbing, you can leave a bunch of skin cells on that rock face. Nobody asked them whether they wanted to die that day on this rock face. You're going to come back and you've had a great day. You've met some social goals. You've met some personal goals. Fantastic. Those cells were not asked if they were up for this. And so we know from human history that these kind of collectivist schemes often end in tragedies, in horrible moral disasters, millions of people dead. So we need to be very careful with this simple way of collectivizing individuals into some sort of greater whole.
I couldn't agree with you more. But I do think if you take your carrying perception of what the agency at different scales is and you embody that, then you don't necessarily. You're building a system that cares for multiple levels, and even within the body, you have multiple organs. They can't. I mean, that's where you get the cancer. That's where it starts to fail. But you can't have one part of the body take over another part. It's like no. You're mutually constrained in order to be alive, and so
somewhat. I mean, there's plenty of competition right within bodies, and we've studied this, and many other people have studied it. I think the biological world has not fully solved that problem yet. And I'm not saying it's not solvable, but what I am saying is that it should be a research project to be looking for optimal cognitive glues. We should be looking for optimal interaction policies that enable the increase of collective intelligence while optimizing
optimal collective glue. Could you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah.
That's a really interesting notion.
Yeah. So my notion of cognitive glue is basically mechanisms that enable individual competent subunits to form some kind of larger system that has goals and memories and preferences that the individuals don't have. So here are and we know that this exists because that's what we are. We are a pile of neurons, but we're not just a pile of neurons. The neurons are connected in a particular way that enables us to have memories and goals that no individual neuron is going to have. So here are a couple of cognitive glues that we've studied. One is something that you can call memory anonymization. So imagine that you have two cells, and what happens is so you got these two cells are sitting next to each other, A and B. Cell A sends a signal. It's some kind of diffusible chemical signal. It goes along. Cell B can feel it on the membrane. Cell B knows perfectly well that this came from the outside. So that means that you can ignore it, you can do something about it, you can remember it, whatever you're going to do, but you know it came from outside. It enables the cells A and B can maintain different histories, different memories. They are different individuals for that reason. It's very easy. Now biology does something interesting. There's this thing called a gap junction, which is basically an electrical synapse, and it enables two cells to kind of dock together the way that two submarines or whatever might do, and small molecules, including electrical signals, can propagate directly from one to the other. Now think of what happens then. Cell A, an event happens. Let's say it gets poked by something. So there's a calcium. There's a calcium spike that occurs. Calcium spike propagates into cell B. Cell B has no way, now cell B has a calcium spike indicative of damage. Cell B may have no way of knowing that this is not mine. All it knows is, well, this is what happened. It doesn't have metadata on it that says, oh, by the way, I'm a false memory. I came from somewhere else. Once you're in, you're in. And so now what you've got is cell A and B has a really hard time maintaining individual memories. They basically they don't share everything, but they share a lot of they have a mind meld. And when you start sharing memories, now you don't have A and B. You have so from the perspective of cell B, that's a false memory. I didn't get poked, he did. But from the perspective of the new unit AB, yeah, it's a veridical memory. We got poked on that side. So these electrical synapses they bind cells towards larger systems that have more memory. They can now do morphogenetic tasks instead of simply physiological tasks and so on. But it comes at the price of wiping out their individuality. They're now one sort of syncytium as far as a lot of memories are concerned. So that's one way of doing it, and you can already see. I mean, do you want to wipe out some of your individuality? I mean, you kind of do if you're going to live in society. You kind of do, but you can see clearly that this can go really really badly if you take it too far. The other type of cognitive glue that we've studied is stress sharing. So imagine that you've got a cell and a bunch of cells on top of it, and it needs to get up there, right? The cell belongs up here, and one of the things that drives the cellular rearrangements is stress. So this cell, it takes a measurement, it can tell it's not in the right place. The stress goes up, it wants to get up there. The other cells are perfectly fine where they are. They have low energy in the sense of simulated annealing. They're not going to move. What this cell can do is start leaking stress. So if I leak my stress molecules, then the neighborhood around me, they all get stressed out. Why? Nothing's wrong with them, but stress molecules are stress molecules. So now the temperature of the whole system gets up. Everything gets a little more plastic. Now I get to where I'm going. Then the whole thing. So what stress sharing does is it makes my problem becomes your problem. Not because you're altruistic and you want to help me, but because me being stressed out is stressing you out. So that's the kind of thing that biology uses. So there's many more that we've thought about.
Well, there are a lot of social analogs to that as well. What you just talked about reminded me of what you were talking in your paper about understanding and memories, and what it is to understand something and what it is to have. And if you could elaborate on that point, I thought that was extremely powerful. In other words, how do we anchor something we understand, and and that becomes. And these are issues now you just see them everywhere right now. I mean, it's like where's the veridical point of this? And then we have stories that we tell ourselves, and those themselves are very fluid, and so and they give coherence to the self, right? I mean, so where are the veridical points within social constructions given that? I mean, if I could throw that.
Yeah, I mean, again, these are fundamental unsolved problems. People talk about these AIs. They sometimes tell you things that are not true, and I was like, well, there's plenty. I mean, there's plenty. Somebody said to me, "My God, these AIs are gonna spread misinformation." Like, have you met people? Like, have you been online before AI showed up? There's plenty of maniacs saying crazy things, and people doing it either on purpose or through ignorance. I mean, knowing where to get veridical information and knowing who to trust, right? Knowing where good information comes from was an issue from day one. Because you can only observe, you live in your tribe lives wherever it lives. You can only see what you see. What other, where does other information come from? And we went through this interesting maybe 100 years where you could get actual evidence of something, meaning that you could have a photograph or a video. That before that period, that didn't exist. And if the king did something, how would you know about it? Well, somebody tells you, and they probably heard it from 20 other people. Yeah, well, how do you know that has anything to do with anything? And now with the advent of image generation, AI, and all of that, that's all going away. So pretty soon, no video, no image is going to be really proof of anything again. So we're back to basically that scenario. So this idea of where to get veridical information is really hard.
So there is, but then you look for sources and trusted sources, and whether you look at the lineage of them. I mean, this gets back. So one of the things we're working at is looking at legal reasoning and what judicial reasoning. Axel Constant's done some work on that, but we're also the idea of rules of evidence in a legal system is really interesting, and how you have rules of evidence, and then you have judicial procedures, and then you have a jury decide what is acceptable. It's sort of a social construct.
Yeah. I mean, I've been on a jury, and it was the most, I was terrified afterwards by watching this process and how it actually works, and how we sat there and tried to figure out what's going on. Something else. But part of the issue is that, and I suggest this exercise. Like all the things that you're pretty sure you believe, and in particular the things that you use to decide where your information comes from, right? So do you know, which of the many news outlets do you follow? Well, I don't follow this one because they're clearly telling me the wrong thing. I like this one. Okay, so track it back and ask yourself which of the things that you're pretty sure about, how do you know any of those things? Yeah, what actually grounds it? Because that's something that people say about AIs, is they say, well, they don't really know this. They were just told, they just got this information. They don't actually ground what they're saying. How many of the things that we say on a daily basis are actually grounded? If you sort of track it back, think. Very few of the things that we are really committed to as being true, we can actually track back to something that we want to stand behind. It usually ends up being somebody told you. That's what it comes back to.
But to this point, though, that is the role of institutions in some sense. I mean, and may they fail, but there's an attempt to establish a set of principles by which then people in kinship system, or even the simplest institutions, try to do that. And so I think that, I guess, if you look at science, I mean, the whole scientific method, I mean, is that is that applicable to sort of establishing social truths? I mean, or a variant of that?
It's hard. The nice thing about the scientific method, some of it, is that it has a shorter this time cycle for showing you who's full of crap and who's not. So we all have we have CD players and binoculars and computers and other things because we managed to sort out. That's what helps us sort out what's actually right. Okay, so you can kind of do that on a social scale, but it takes a lot of time and people die. That's the problem. Is that if you want to find out which system of governance is good and bad, it's really hard to just do the experiment and say, well, eventually it'll shake out and we'll have a good one. That's really hard.
But you can do simulations now. You could do, I mean, agentic simulations. You can explore a space of possible governance mechanisms without actually doing it.
You can, and that's one of the things I was suggesting actually, is that identifying candidates for a good cognitive glue that might be a good candidate is exactly something that we should be doing. We should have a search process. Now you have to be very careful because in all these simulations, boy, a lot rides on the assumptions you put into the simulation, and you can imagine people with different political bents will make a very different assumptions in these simulations. But yes, I do think that we should actually be testing all kinds of possible interaction protocols to see what actually allows. Presumably, I mean, the optimistic expectation is that there is such a thing. There may not be, but hopefully there is, where we can find interaction policies that allow a collective intelligence to benefit without trampling the welfare of the components that make it up.
So there's another topic I'd like to briefly top on, and that is, I mean, it's something that Chris Fields talks about, and you worked with him. But the idea of quantum information, and the physics of being about communication across interfaces. And there's one way of framing this, a certain school, and I'd be interested in your thinking about it, is that you have things in a quantum, you sort of have qubits over here, you have bits over here, and that you have things, it's coming into being, so that in the Archibald Wheeler thing, coming into being, observers, but that some would argue consciousness, and this is where I'm getting at Penrose's notion of objective reduction, comes out of that interaction, and that there is this communication across these boundaries, and you go from sort of a topological space into geometric space, you go into something that. And so we've generally, in a Western framework, we've tended to think of things as scientific as being within the classical space. But now we recognize that there's this interaction. And now I think I mentioned to you in our email earlier that there is this work on Hameroff and Penrose saying, actually, we look at microtubules, and there is a mechanism actually at the brain and at the cellular level that allows us to do that. There seems to be growing evidence that this is possible, and you have so what is intelligence, or consciousness is really at a subneuronal, very sort of at this very elemental scale, and it seemed to me open up a new way of understanding what intelligence is in that interaction. I mean, what is that? and in that perspective, it seems to be similar to what the things that Chris was articulating in his notion of the being having a holographic screen, on that interface.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any expertise in quantum anything, so I'm hardly going to be able to improve on anything Chris told you. But I think microtubules are fascinating. I think no doubt they are a locus for very important aspects of cognition and biology. I will say that I think consciousness is fundamental. I don't believe that we make it. I don't believe that either.
I think that's true. I mean, yeah. I think
either in the biological.
Yeah.
Right. So what I see, right. So what I see as these kinds of physical objects that we make, be they microtubule based, be they other types of biological materials, and frankly non-biological materials, I'm sure, what they are pointers into a space of not only Platonic truths about things like triangles and the facts of number theory and things like that, but kinds of minds. And so I definitely think that we're dealing with a space. Yeah. So I kind of like this this idea of from I guess Whitehead's idea of ingressions from this Platonic space. I think this is why we get surprised with these emergent behaviors, not just complexity, but actually different kinds of minds, and this is why even the most simple minimal things that we make, like sorting algorithms, like a simple, minimal active matter, those droplets and things like that. You get these behaviors because you didn't make those behaviors. What you made is a physical system that allows them. It enabled it to ingress. And when we make AIs, we're plumbing a region of that space that maybe has never been reached, has never been plumbed before, at least on Earth, maybe anywhere. And this is why with these kinds of things you always get more out than you put in. And this idea that you've made the pointer and now you know what it does is, I think, very dangerous. And we should be clear that we have just at the beginning of a long research agenda to map out that space. This is why
Why is it dangerous? You said it's very. Why did you say it's dangerous? Why couldn't it be beneficial?
I'm not saying the contents of the space are dangerous. So it's plenty of beneficial things in there too. I'm saying what's dangerous is the assumption that the pointer is the thing that you're going to get. These things that we make, right? When you made a physical, whether it's a machine or a simple machine or a biological or whatever, and you think, okay, well, here it is. I know the algorithms. I know the materials. I know what that's dangerous because you're going to get things you don't know what you're going to get, and so it's what I think is really not great is when people come across some of these things, like the Feigenbaum's constant and the four-color theorem and these other things or facts about networks, and they say, well, that's just something that holds in the physical world. I say, so what aspect of physics explains this? And they say, nah, it's not physics. It's just the fact that holds. Well, the problem with a big bag of random facts that hold is that you're going to be surprised every time it happens. And you can write them down and kind of say, wow, that's cool. It's an emergent thing. And what that word emergence does is it hides, it makes it seem like you understood what's happening. It absolves you from the responsibility of knowing where the next one is, and it forecloses the hope of finding the one you want to find because it's just stuff that holds. No, I think we need to commit to this idea that what we're investigating is an ordered space of patterns. There are many patterns in that space. Some of them are very low agency, things about triangles and whatnot, and prime numbers, and some of them are high agency things like kinds of minds. And we need to be mapping that space systematically, not pretending that emergence is something that explains anything, and that we could just sort of make a catalog of crazy stuff that emerges from time to time.
That's fabulous. So where do you see taking this point of view, I mean, where else is this being pursued? I mean, in your lab, is there a broad? Do you feel that there's a broader scientific consensus around this? Say, okay, consciousness is fundamental. Some of these things that you're saying, exploring this space, is this something? I mean, I heard Carl say, well, someone said, well, this is used to be it used to be heresy. Maybe it's no longer heresy, or is it still heresy? But where does it fit?
Yeah, it depends. It depends who you're talking to. I always know what department I'm in based on which part of my talk makes people angry. So there are things you can say in the neuroscience department that are completely obvious, and if you say the same thing in the genetics department, it's heresy. These things that we're talking about now, I think, are many places are definitely heresy. Some places are willing to consider them. Different audiences, bioengineers, artificial life, those tend to be the most open-minded audiences, and they have the least sort of preconceptions about how stuff is supposed to go, and they're sort of willing to think about these things. A lot of science audiences are still very traditional, so this this stuff seems completely crazy to them. So. I think it's certainly better than it was before, but again, this is part of why I insist on experiment. And people say, you shouldn't think about all these crazy things. You should just do the science. I say, no. There's a reason why we did these experiments that nobody else had done before, right? Why didn't somebody else do these? Because there is no such thing as doing science without some kind of generative framework behind it, some kind of philosophical assumptions behind it. You might not know what they are or think about them, but they're there. And for all of these things, if somebody says, I don't want to think about it in this particular way, you say, great, let's see what happens. You do some experiments, we will do some experiments, and we will see what the research program ends up being. So that's why it's not just it can't just be philosophy. It has to intersect with the real world.
So, do you think then, just from that perspective, that you can do experiments and applying it to areas, example, to economics or governance or social construction?
That's a good question. I don't know. We just with some of them, like in a lot of sciences, some of these experiments have limitations of both practicality and ethics that I'm not sure that you could do.
We do simulations. You can do simulation. I mean, I guess there's a lot of assumptions in economics about how value is created and how collective action is achieved and consensus achieved, and it's based upon, I think, pretty primitive mechanisms. And you're presenting much more sophisticated mechanism to do that. And so the argument being, can you create greater economic value and stability and homeostasis by being able to apply these ideas into new kinds of firms and new kinds of organizations?
I think there's plenty of work to be done there. Ben Lyons and I just published something on the price system as a cognitive glue, and looking at economics and as an example of this collective intelligence. Yeah. So no, I think this is a very important thing to study. It's actually critical.
This is a wonderful conversation for me, and I really appreciate it. And you've elucidated many profound points, and I recommend any listeners to read your paper.
Thank you. I appreciate that.